Welcome to the debate. Today, we're wading into, well, one of the most contentious legal challenges of the year, the appeal launched by Sean P. Diddy Combs against his 4-year, 2-month federal prison sentence. And this isn't just about a high-profile defendant. It's really about a profound constitutional conflict that happens, pretty routinely in our courts.
It really is. I think this case has become the ultimate test case for the principle of judicial fairness during sentencing. Combs was convicted of 2 specific lesser prostitution-related charges under the Mann Act. That's the federal law that governs transporting individuals across state lines for immoral purposes. But the crux of his appeal, the real heart of it, is what the jury didn't convict him of: racketeering, conspiracy, and sex trafficking.
Absolutely. And so the legal battle really hinges on whether the sentencing judge, Judge Arun Subramanian, overstepped his authority. So the central question for us today is this: did the judge commit judicial error by allowing evidence from the acquitted charges to significantly and inappropriately inflate the prison term, acting, as the defense alleges, as a kind of 13th juror? Or was this comprehensive consideration necessary, even justified, to accurately reflect the gravity of the offenses he was convicted of?
And I'll be arguing, very much in line with the defense's filing, that the judge fundamentally violated the spirit, if not the actual letter, of the jury's findings. By making his own factual determinations of coercion and exploitation, things that mirrored the elements of the acquitted felonies, he imposed a sentence that is just wildly disproportionate and, frankly, undermines the whole sanctity of an acquittal.
And I'm going to argue the other side of that coin, that the judge's decision to consider the full pattern of conduct, the extreme abuse of power and control that was documented during the trial, was not only permissible under established sentencing law, but was, in fact, the essential function of a court trying to administer justice that's proportional to the actual harm inflicted by this specific defendant.
Okay, so let's start with the facts of the conviction itself and the disparity that immediately, flags a major concern. Combs was acquitted of the big charges. The 2 counts he was convicted of are often handled with minimal, if any, prison time. His lawyers point out that the sentence he got, 4 years and 2 months, so 50 months, is an extreme upward departure from the norms. For these specific offenses, even when some level of coercion is involved, defendants typically get less than 15 months.
Right, and while that statistical difference is striking, we have to look at why that difference exists. My position is founded on a pretty established principle that sentencing requires a holistic view of the defendant's character and the specific mechanism of the crime. Judge Subramanian was explicit. He said he was relying on the principle of relevant conduct, which is, it's enshrined right there in the U.S. sentencing guidelines, to set the punishment for these Mann Act violations.
But the line between relevant conduct and just retrying a case is perilously thin here, and the defense argues the judge didn't just step over it, he pole vaulted over it. The judge stated he considered Combs' treatment of 2 former girlfriends, Cassandra Cassie, Ventura, and another woman known as Jane. He openly rejected the defense's framing of the whole thing, the so-called freak-offs and hotel nights, as merely intimate consensual experiences.
And that rejection is critical. It's critical because the judge is mandated to assess the true nature of the crime, no matter how narrowly the conviction was framed. The judge's findings were that Combs, and I'm quoting here, abused the power and control that he had over the lives of women, and used that abuse especially when it came to freak-offs and hotel nights. That link right there between the abuse and the convicted act is what justifies the severity.
I just come at it from a completely different direction. The judicial findings, however compelling the evidence might have seemed to the judge, they fundamentally contradicted the jury's verdict. The jury did not find the necessary elements of force, fraud, or coercion for a sex trafficking or racketeering conviction. Yet the judge made his own definitive factual determinations that Combs coerced, exploited, and forced his girlfriends. When a judge makes findings that directly map onto the elements of an acquitted crime and then imposes a penalty based on those findings, well, those judicial findings have functionally trumped the verdict.
I think that assumes a false equivalency between the burden of proof for conviction and the standard for sentencing. And let's just clarify a key technical point here for our audience. For conviction, the standard is beyond a reasonable doubt. That's an incredibly high bar. But at sentencing, a judge is usually permitted to consider facts, including facts from acquitted charges, if they're proven by a preponderance of the evidence, which is a much, much lower threshold.
That is a compelling point, and it's rooted in case law, I know, like United States versus Watts, which confirmed that judges can consider acquitted conduct. However, the legal philosophy behind Watts is under intense scrutiny today, precisely because of cases like this one. How can a court possibly justify a sentence based on findings, coercion, exploitation, that directly relate to the specific elements of the serious charges the jury already said there wasn't enough evidence for? It seems to challenge the very core of the Sixth Amendment right to a jury trial.
Well, the Watts decision established that an acquittal only means the government failed to prove its case beyond a reasonable doubt. It doesn't mean the conduct didn't happen. So the judge's job is to assess the real offense conduct. The question for the appellate court isn't whether the judge thought Combs was a bad person. It's whether the judge abused his discretion by finding by a preponderance of the evidence that this abuse of power was inseparable from the mechanism by which the Mann Act violations were actually committed.
I see the logic, but let's look at the practical implications. The jury was presented with extensive, horrific testimony. Ventura testified Combs ordered her to have, quote, disgusting sex with strangers hundreds of times. They saw that video of him dragging and beating her. They heard Jane's testimony about being pressured into sex with male workers. And despite all this horrible evidence, the jury was constrained by the law, by the strict definition of the statutes, and they could not find beyond a reasonable doubt that those major felonies occurred. So if a judge is allowed to just reintroduce all of that under a lower standard and inflate the sentence by over 300%, doesn't that just render the jury verdict meaningless for powerful defendants?
I think that reasoning overlooks the specificity of the convicted offenses. The judge wasn't punishing Combs for just generalized abuse. He was finding that the abuse of power provided the context and the mechanism for the two convicted prostitution offenses. The Mann Act convictions here were facilitated by a documented systemic pattern of coercion and control. The judge's finding ensures that the punishment for that Mann Act violation is calibrated to the defendant's unique position of power and the severity of his actions, not treated as some routine transactional offense.
Okay, let's pivot directly to the unprecedented way the sentencing matrix was applied. The gap between a typical 15-month sentence and Diddy's 50-month sentence is, to the defense, conclusive proof of error. If the conviction was for lesser counts that didn't inherently involve force, the sentence just cannot legally carry the full weight of the acquitted allegations, especially not the physical abuse of Ventura.
But the court is mandated to acknowledge the full scope of harm in this specific case. And this case is so far from typical. The judge explicitly said he had to reject the defense's attempt to minimize everything. I mean, when you consider the testimony, systematic drug use, hundreds of forced encounters, that video evidence of physical violence, you realize this case is absolutely not remotely similar to the standard Mann Act violation we see in federal court.
But the sentence has to be rooted in the crime of conviction. That video of Ventura being beaten, while it is deeply disturbing, it relates primarily to assault or domestic violence conduct for which he was not convicted federally. A judge can't just punish a defendant for being a generally abusive person. The punishment has to tie back proportionately to the specific criminal statute that was violated. This huge upward departure suggests the sentence was, in reality, a punishment for the conduct the state failed to prove in the first place.
I disagree with that fundamentally. The law allows for these enhancements when a defendant abuses a position of trust or uses extraordinary means to commit a crime. Combs used his celebrity, his wealth, his position of power, a position of absolute control over his victims' careers and lives, to facilitate the two convicted Mann Act offenses. The judge justified the heightened sentence by linking that exploitation directly to the execution of the crime. So when a court recognizes that the crime was executed through a mechanism of systemic control and dehumanization, the punitive response for that specific crime has to be commensurate with that level of depravity.
Okay, but this forces us to address the standard of review for judicial error. The appeals court will be looking to see if the judge committed an abuse of discretion, and for the judge to make explicit findings that Combs forced and exploited his girlfriends, which were the very findings the jury was required to make on the racketeering and sex trafficking counts. That is arguably a clear abuse of discretion. The judge is substituting his own factual conclusions for the jury's finding of not guilty.
That's an interesting point, but I would frame it differently. The judge wasn't substituting his judgment on the legal elements of sex trafficking, which are very specific. He was fulfilling his statutory duty to provide clear, non-arbitrary reasoning for why this defendant deserved a sentence so far beyond the median. By considering the extensive, chilling testimony of Ventura and Jane, which covered a pattern extending over years, the judge ensured the punishment fit the criminal pattern related to the convicted act. He was showing the mechanism by which Combs operated to get your way, which resulted in these Mann Act violations.
If the appellate court allows this, we are granting judges the power to essentially nullify an acquittal in any high-profile case where there's significant evidence that just failed to meet that beyond a reasonable doubt standard. It creates a perverse incentive. The state can fail to prove the major crime, yet the defendant still suffers the penalty for that crime under the guise of relevant conduct for a minor conviction.
And that is the core legal tension in modern sentencing. I'll grant you that. However, the system is designed to allow judges the flexibility to address the specific criminal reality in front of them. And the fact that the correctional system itself has classified Diddy's confinement as high level, his transfer from MDC Brooklyn to FCI Fort Dix, placing him in a specialized drug treatment unit, it suggests that the administrative system recognizes the severe, comprehensive nature of his underlying conduct. This administrative response aligns with the judge's determination of gravity rather than the defense's narrow focus on the two Mann Act counts alone.
I'm sorry, I just don't buy that a prison transfer validates the judicial decision. The operational classification of a prisoner is totally separate from the legal determination of sentencing error. The central issue remains the judge's explicit finding of coercion and force. If those findings, elements the jury rejected, are used to impose a 50-month sentence, the integrity of the original verdict is, it's irrevocably compromised. This legal maneuver turns relevant conduct into a loophole that just swallows a constitutional protection against being punished for a crime you are acquitted of.
And I see it this way. The judge's approach used a testimony detailing the systemic abuse of power to accurately characterize the true severity of the convicted Mann Act offenses. This was an exercise of discretion to ensure the sentence was tailored to this specific defendant and the magnitude of harm he inflicted, acknowledging that his crimes were carried out through extraordinary means of exploitation and control, which justifies that extreme upward departure from the normal guidelines.
And the appellate court has to determine whether that exercise of discretion amounted to an abuse. If the judge's explicit factual findings of coercion and force, which contradict the jury's verdict, are allowed to stand as the basis for the highest sentence ever imposed for these offenses, then the defense is right. The integrity of the original verdict is compromised, and that would require either an immediate reduction of the sentence or a remand for resentencing based only on the facts directly proven by the conviction.
Through the sentencing guidelines, it presents a profound and a continuing challenge to our justice system. The resolution of this appeal will set a significant precedent for how higher courts weigh the philosophy of judicial latitude against the constitutional protection of an acquittal, especially when the underlying conduct is as horrific as the testimony in this case suggested.
It really is a constitutional showdown waiting to happen. And there's clearly so much more to explore in this material as the appellate process unfolds, which will ultimately determine the true scope of a judge's power after the jury has spoken.